Galway Thorne stood at the front of her classroom at Roosevelt Technical High School on a Monday morning in September, watching 28 faces stare back at her with varying degrees of interest and apathy. She was 31 years old, stood 5'4" in her sensible flats, and had the kind of unassuming appearance that made people overlook her in crowds. Mousy brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down her nose, clothes from Target that hung loose on her slight frame. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a first-year social studies teacher trying to find her footing in the American public education system. What none of them knew, what nobody at Roosevelt Technical knew, was that for the previous 8 years, Galway had stood in front of very different groups of people. She had been the lead defensive tactics instructor at the King County Police Academy in Washington State, responsible for teaching hundreds of recruits how to control resistant suspects, survive physical altercations, and maintain composure under pressure. She had held black belts in both Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo, had competed in grappling tournaments across the Pacific Northwest, and had a reputation among law enforcement circles as someone who could make a 200-pound recruit tap out in under 30 seconds. Her hands, small and unremarkable looking, had executed thousands of joint locks, throws, and control holds. Her body, despite its unimposing size, moved with the efficiency of someone who understood leverage, angles, and how to use an opponent's strength against them. She had left that world behind 6 months ago. The decision had come after watching her father die slowly of cancer, after holding his hand through the final weeks and listening to him express regret about the students he'd never gotten to teach in his retirement, the young minds he'd never gotten to shape. Her father had been an educator his entire life, and in those last conversations, he'd asked Galway why she spent her time teaching people to hurt others instead of teaching young people to think, to question, to grow. The question had haunted her through the funeral and the empty months after. She'd handed in her resignation, gone back to school for her teaching credential, and accepted the first position offered to her at Roosevelt Technical High School in Cleveland, Ohio. 3,000 miles from her old life, in a place where nobody knew her name or her background. She had made herself a promise the day she signed her teaching contract. She would never use her training again. Never demonstrate what she could do. Never let violence be part of her identity anymore. She wanted to be someone who built up instead of broke down, who created thinkers instead of fighters. Her father would have been proud of that promise. The first week of school passed in the typical chaos of new beginnings. Galway learned her students' names, established classroom routines, and tried to inject some enthusiasm into lessons about the Constitution and the Revolutionary War. Most students were respectful, if disengaged. A few showed genuine interest in the material. And then there was Crew Hartman. Crew sat in the back right corner of her third-period American history class, surrounded by 3 other boys who seemed to orbit him like satellites around a sun. He was tall for his age, probably 6'1", with the build of someone who spent significant time in the weight room. He had that particular kind of confidence that came from being good-looking, athletic, and popular. The kind of confidence that could easily tip into arrogance. His father, Galway had learned from casual staff room conversation, was Richard Hartman, a prominent personal injury attorney in Cleveland whose face smiled from billboards across the city. "Hartman gets results," the slogan proclaimed in bold letters. Apparently, the son had inherited both his father's good looks and his aggressive personality. The first incident happened on a Wednesday in the second week. Galway was explaining the concept of checks and balances when she heard snickering from the back corner. She paused mid-sentence and looked toward the sound. Crew was showing something on his phone to the boys around him, Jordan Castleman, Travis Pugh, and Damian Torres, all three of them struggling to contain their laughter. "Crew, phones away, please," Galway said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. He looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Sorry, Miss Thorne, just checking the time." He made a show of putting the phone in his pocket while his friends continued to smirk. She continued with the lesson, but the moment had planted a seed. She noticed the way Crew whispered to his friends while she wrote on the board, the way their eyes would dart to her and then away when she turned around, the laughter that would erupt and then die down as she approached their corner of the room. Nothing overt enough to address directly, but enough to create an undercurrent of disruption. By Friday of that week, the pattern had established itself more clearly. When Galway called on Crew to answer a question about the 3/5 compromise, he responded with an exaggerated sigh and said, "I don't know, Miss Thorne. That stuff is so old it's probably from when you were born." The class had laughed nervously, unsure if they were allowed to join in. Galway had felt heat rise in her neck, but kept her voice steady as she moved on to another student. The following Monday brought a new variation. Galway was handing back graded essays, walking between rows of desks and placing papers face down to protect privacy. When she reached Crew's desk, she set down his paper, a C-, generous considering the lack of evidence and analysis, and started to move toward the next student. Her differently after that, not with respect, but with pity or contempt. Wednesday brought a more brazen move. Galway had assigned group work and was circulating around the classroom, checking in on different clusters of students. When she approached Crew's group in the back corner, she found them looking at his laptop screen instead of working on the assignment. Before she could say anything, Crew swiveled the screen toward her. On it was a meme someone had created, a still image from a movie of a tiny, mousy woman wearing large glasses, with text overlaid that read, "When you think you can teach, but you look like a lost hamster." The image bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Galway. "Hey, Miss Thorne, have you seen this meme?" "It's hilarious," Crew said, his voice dripping with false innocence. His friends were barely containing their laughter. "Someone posted it in the Roosevelt Tech group chat last night. It's gotten like 200 likes already." Galway felt something cold settle in her stomach. She looked at the screen, then at Crew's face, which showed a carefully practiced expression of innocent interest. She had two choices: acknowledge the obvious mockery and risk escalating the situation, or pretend not to notice and appear even weaker. "Interesting," she said evenly. "Now please get back to the assignment. You're analyzing primary sources about westward expansion, not memes." She moved away, maintaining her composure, but her hands were trembling slightly as she checked in with the next group. That evening in her apartment, Galway sat on her second-hand couch and opened her laptop. After a moment's hesitation, she searched for the Roosevelt Technical High School unofficial group page. She found it easily, a poorly moderated social media group with over 800 members, mostly current students. She scrolled through posts about football games, homework help requests, and typical high school drama until she found it, the meme. 234 likes, 63 comments, most of them laugh-crying emojis, several saying things like, "OMG, that's so accurate," and "Thorne is literally the weakest teacher ever." One comment stood out: "She won't last the semester, too soft, too easy to mess with." It was from Crew Hartman. Galway closed the laptop. She walked to her bedroom closet and pushed aside hanging clothes to reveal a small duffel bag she hadn't opened since moving to Cleveland. Inside were her old GI from the academy, carefully folded and still smelling faintly of the mats at her old training facility. Underneath were her black belts, the heavy cotton ones she'd earned through years of dedication, pain, and thousands of hours of practice. She ran her fingers over the worn fabric, remembering the person she used to be, the instructor who could walk into a room full of aggressive, confident recruits and command immediate respect. The woman who had once subdued a resisting suspect during a training demonstration. So efficiently that the entire class had gone silent in shock. She thought about her father's words, about her promise, about the path she had chosen and why she had chosen it. Then she carefully folded everything back into the bag, pushed it to the back of the closet, and returned to her lesson planning for the next day. Thursday began with Galway finding her classroom door decorated with printouts of the hamster meme taped in a grid pattern. She carefully removed each one, folding them neatly and disposing of them in the recycling bin while students filtered past on their way to first period. Some smirked, others looked away, embarrassed. A few younger students looked sympathetic, but said nothing. Her third period class that day was particularly challenging. Crew had apparently decided to test exactly how far he could push. When Galway asked students to open their textbooks to page 217, Crew announced loudly, "I don't have my book today. I think someone stole it." "There's a class set in the cabinet," Galway said. "You can use one of those." "Can you get it for me? My back hurts from football practice." She paused in the middle of distributing handouts. "You're capable of walking to the cabinet, Crew." "Wow, so much for accommodating student needs," he said, his voice layered with mock disappointment. "Isn't that like your job? To help us?" The class had gone quiet, watching the exchange. Galway could feel the test happening, the way power dynamics were being negotiated in real time. In her old world, this kind of challenge would have been met with immediate consequences. Push-ups, dismissal from training, a verbal dressing down that left no question about the chain of command. But here, she was supposed to be nurturing, understanding, patient. "Your need appears to be a textbook," Galway said, keeping her voice level. "The textbooks are in the cabinet. You're welcome to get one whenever you're ready to participate in today's lesson." Crew made a show of sighing dramatically, hauling himself out of his chair with exaggerated slowness and shuffling to the cabinet. On his way back, he accidentally knocked 3 other students' textbooks off their desks. The books hit the floor with loud bangs. "Oops," he said, making no move to pick them up. Galway felt her jaw tighten. She forced herself to breathe slowly to maintain the calm exterior. "Please pick those up. I've got a bad back, remember? Pick them up or I'll need to write you a referral." The word referral seemed to amuse him. He laughed outright. "Oh no, a referral. I'm so scared. My dad gets those thrown out before lunch. He's friends with Principal Morrison. They play golf together." It was true. Galway had learned from other teachers. Richard Hartman was apparently a significant booster for the school's athletic programs and had made substantial donations to the Roosevelt Technical Foundation. His son understood very well that he operated with a certain level of immunity. Galway said nothing. She simply pulled out her phone and took a photo of the books on the floor, then made a note in her class log. Crew, sensing he'd lost some of the dramatic impact, bent down and picked up the books with exaggerated slowness, dropping them carelessly onto the desks they'd fallen from. The lesson that day limped along through constant interruptions. Every time Galway posed a discussion question, Crew had a sarcastic comment. When she wrote on the board, she heard his stage-whispered commentary to his friends about her handwriting, her clothes, the way she stood. The other students began to disengage, some looking uncomfortable, others checking out entirely on their phones. By the time the bell rang, Galway felt exhausted in a way she'd never experienced during her most grueling training sessions at the academy. That afternoon, during her planning period, she knocked on the door of Vice Principal Andrea Chen's office. Chen was a middle-aged woman with a reputation for being fair but pragmatic. Someone who had been in education administration for over 15 years and had seen everything at least twice. "Come in," Chen called. She looked up from her computer as Galway entered. "Miss Thorne, what can I do for you?" Galway sat in the chair across from the desk and pulled out her phone, showing Chen the photo of the knocked-over textbooks and her class log documenting the incidents. Experiences calling the Hartman household. "I wanted to discuss this with you first, establish what support I can expect from administration." Chen's expression grew more guarded. "We support all our teachers, Miss Thorne, but I need you to understand that we also have to balance a lot of different factors. Student relationships with families, community partnerships, legal considerations. The Hartman family has been very involved with Roosevelt Technical. Mr. Hartman Sr. has been incredibly generous with the athletic programs." There it was, the reality, stated plainly. Galway felt something harden in her chest. "So what you're saying is that documenting behavioral issues with Crew Hartman is unlikely to result in meaningful consequences because of his father's donations." "That's not what I said," Chen replied sharply. "What I'm saying is that I need you to exhaust all other classroom management strategies before we escalate to formal disciplinary action. Try building a relationship with Crew. Find out what motivates him. Differentiate your instruction to keep him engaged. Call home and partner with his parents. Document everything, yes, but also work on your end to create a more positive classroom environment." The message was clear. You're on your own, and if you push this, you'll be the one who faces consequences for not being able to handle your classroom. Galway left Chen's office feeling a familiar frustration that she hadn't experienced since her early days at the Academy. Back when she was a young woman, trying to establish authority with recruits who assumed she couldn't possibly be qualified to teach them anything, she had proven them wrong through demonstration, by showing she was faster, more technical, more knowledgeable than they expected. But she couldn't do that here. She had made a promise to leave that version of herself behind. The weekend provided a brief respite. But Monday arrived with the inevitability of gravity. Galway walked into her classroom to find her desk had been rearranged. Her carefully organized papers were scattered. Her stapler was missing. The framed photo of her father that she kept in the corner had been turned face down. It was petty vandalism, nothing technically against school rules since nothing was damaged. But it was a clear message. Your space isn't safe. You have no control here. She spent the time before first period restoring order, trying not to think about how many times this had happened to teachers before her, how many had eventually quit or transferred. Roosevelt Technical had a high turnover rate for new teachers. She was beginning to understand why. Third period arrived. Crew walked in with his usual swagger, flanked by his three friends. They took their seats in the back corner, and Galway noticed they were all wearing matching expressions of barely suppressed amusement. She started the class with a warm-up question about the previous week's reading. "Put it away, or I'm writing you up and calling your father." "Oh no, not my dad," Crew said mockingly. "Guess I better shape up." He made no move to put the toy away, just tossed it to Jordan, who caught it and squeezed it squeak. Then Jordan tossed it to Travis. Squeak. Then to Damien. Squeak. The four of them playing keep away with the hamster toy, while the class descended into chaos. Galway walked to the phone on the wall and picked up the receiver, dialing the main office. The boys noticed and went quiet, the toy disappearing into someone's backpack. She waited for someone to pick up, but the line just rang and rang. Budget cuts had reduced office staff to the point that nobody was available to answer during peak class times. She hung up and turned back to the class. The next person who disrupts this lesson will be sent to the office with a full write-up, she said, trying to inject authority into her voice. But she could hear how it sounded, hollow, desperate, a threat without teeth. Crew leaned back in his chair, balancing it on two legs, and smirked. "Whatever you say, Miss Thorne." She tried to continue the lesson, but the learning environment had been destroyed. Students were on their phones, talking among themselves, completely checked out. Galway went through the motions of teaching to a room that had stopped listening. When the bell finally rang, students filed out in clusters, some still laughing about the hamster toy. She heard one girl say to her friend, "That was kind of mean, though," but the friend just shrugged. Crew was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back. "You know, Miss Thorne, I don't think you're cut out for this job, just some friendly advice." Then he walked out, leaving Galway alone in her classroom, hands shaking with suppressed rage and humiliation. That night, Galway did something she hadn't done in months. She went for a run at the local park, pushing herself hard, trying to exhaust the frustration from her body. When running wasn't enough, she found an outdoor pull-up bar and did sets until her arms trembled. Then she found a quiet spot under a tree and went through the motions of solo drilling, movements so ingrained they emerged automatically: hip escapes, technical stand-ups, shrimping. Her body remembered everything her mind was trying to forget. As she moved through the drills, muscle memory taking over, she thought about her father. Would he still be proud of her promise? Would he understand that sometimes turning the other cheek just meant letting yourself be destroyed? Or would he tell her that real strength wasn't about submission, but about choosing the right battles and fighting them with wisdom? She didn't have answers. She just had the movement, the familiar patterns that had once defined her identity. When she finally stopped, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, she felt marginally better, more like herself. But she also felt the weight of knowing that this version of herself, the capable, strong, competent version, couldn't exist in her classroom, not if she wanted to keep her promise. The following week brought a new development that made everything worse. Galway arrived at school on Tuesday to find that the hamster meme had evolved. Now there were multiple variations posted in the school's social media group. Hamster teacher versus her students. When you try to give a lecture, but you're 3 feet tall. The hamster's guide to managing a classroom. Spoiler, she can't. Each one had hundreds of reactions. Some students had started calling her hamster in the hallways, usually just loud enough for her to hear, but not so loud she could definitively identify the speaker. In third period that week, Crew escalated again. He had been somewhat subdued after the toy incident, perhaps sensing he'd pushed far enough for the moment. But by Thursday, he was back with renewed creativity. During a lesson about the War of 1812, he raised his hand. "Yes, Crew," Galway said warily, "I have a question about teaching methods." "This is history class, not pedagogy class." "Yeah, but how do teachers get hired? Do they have to pass a test or something?" "There are certification requirements, yes. But what about physical requirements? If you're really small and weak-looking, can you still be a teacher? Because I feel like students might not respect someone who looks like they could blow away in a strong wind." The classroom went very quiet. Several students looked shocked. Others looked away, embarrassed to witness this. A few looked interested, curious to see how Galway would respond. She felt something shift inside her, a tectonic plate of tolerance sliding past the mantle of restraint. Her voice, when she spoke, came out different than it had before. Lower, colder, carrying an edge that hadn't been there in previous encounters. "That question isn't relevant to today's lesson, Crew. We're discussing the War of 1812. If you have a question about that topic, I'm happy to answer it. Crew must have heard something in her tone because he hesitated fractionally before pushing forward. I'm just saying, respect is important in a classroom, right? And it's hard to respect someone who seems, weak. What makes you think I'm weak? The question hung in the air. Crew's smirk faltered slightly. I mean, no offense, but you let us walk all over you. You don't do anything when we mess with you. That's pretty weak. Galway walked slowly toward his desk, her footsteps deliberate on the linoleum floor. Students' heads swiveled to follow her movement. She stopped about 6 feet from Crew's desk, close enough to make her point, far enough to maintain professional space. Let me clarify something, she said, her voice still carrying that cold, controlled edge. Choosing not to respond to provocation isn't weakness, it's restraint. They're very different things. Weakness is when you can't do something. Restraint is when you can do something but choose not to. The question you should be asking yourself is, which one applies to me? For the first time since school began, Crew looked uncertain. Something in Galway's posture, in her tone, in the way she held eye contact without blinking, had shifted the dynamic his friends noticed too. Sitting up straighter in their chairs, the casual mockery draining from their faces. Whatever, Crew muttered, breaking eye contact and looking down at his desk. Galway held her position for another moment, then returned to the front of the room and continued the lesson. The class was notably quieter for the rest of the period, but she knew this wasn't over. She'd drawn a line, made a statement that challenged Crew's understanding of her. That meant he would have to push back harder to reassert his dominance, to prove to his friends and himself that he was still in control. She was right. Friday brought the biggest incident yet. Galway had cafeteria duty during fourth period lunch, something all teachers rotated through on a weekly basis. It was generally considered an unpleasant task, monitoring 500 students in a loud, chaotic space, breaking up conflicts before they escalated, enforcing rules about food fights and vandalism. Galway stood near the entrance to the cafeteria, visible but trying to be unobtrusive, watching the controlled chaos of lunchtime. The kind of movement that looked almost choreographed in its precision. The cafeteria had gone silent. 500 students stared at the small, mousy teacher who had moved like water flowing around a rock crew, was on the ground where his momentum had carried him, staring up at Galway with wide eyes. His friends were frozen at their table, mouths open. Galway looked down at Crew. She could see the calculation in his eyes. He'd expected her to be hit, to be humiliated in front of the entire school, to stand there dripping with spaghetti sauce while everyone laughed. Instead, he was the one on the ground, while she stood clean and composed, barely having moved. That looked like quite a fall, Galway said, her voice carrying in the silent cafeteria. Are you hurt? Do you need to see the nurse? Crew scrambled to his feet, his face reddening. I tripped. It was an accident. I see. Well, accidents happen. I'll get someone to clean this up. You should return to your seat. But Crew couldn't leave it at that. His humiliation demanded recompense, required him to reassert dominance. You moved pretty fast, he said loudly, projecting his voice for the audience. Almost like you were expecting me to trip. Were you watching me, Miss Thorne? That's kinda creepy. The cafeteria stirred with new interest. Galway met his eyes steadily. I watch all students during lunch duty. That's what supervision means. Now please return to your seat. Or what? You gonna make me? D. The challenge hung in the air between them, weighted with all the accumulated tension of the past weeks. Galway felt the eyes of the entire cafeteria on her, felt the decision point crystallizing. She could back down, retreat, maintain her promise never to use her training, or she could respond, could finally push back in a way that would end this pattern once and for all. She chose neither option. Instead, she said calmly, "I'm going to do what I always do when students refuse to follow reasonable directions. I'm going to document this incident and follow our school's behavioral procedures. Your choice, whether this ends here or escalates further." Crew's jaw clenched. For a moment, Galway thought he might actually take a swing at her, might cross that final line. Part of her, the part she'd been trying to suppress for months, almost wanted him to, because if he threw the first punch, everything that happened after would be justified self-defense. But Crew wasn't stupid. He knew somewhere in his calculating mind that physically attacking a teacher would cross into territory even his father couldn't protect him from. So instead, he laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You're pathetic," he said. "Everybody knows it. You can't control us. You can't do anything. You're just a weak little hamster pretending to be a teacher." He turned and walked back to his table, his friends greeting him with backslaps and laughter. The cafeteria gradually returned to its normal noise level, students turning back to their lunches and conversations. But Galway could feel the shift in the atmosphere. She'd avoided the food, had shown reflexes that surprised people, but she'd still been publicly disrespected with no real consequences. The message to every student watching was clear: you can humiliate teachers without repercussions. She spent her afternoon classes trying to focus on lessons, but part of her mind was replaying the cafeteria scene, thinking about all the ways it could have gone differently. In her old life, someone pulling a stunt like that would have found themselves controlled and subdued in seconds, made an example of in front of everyone watching. But that wasn't who she was supposed to be anymore. After school, Galway returned to Chen's office. This time she had documentation of everything: photos, log entries, witness statements from other teachers who'd observed incidents, screenshots of the social media posts. She laid it all out on Chen's desk methodically, explaining each piece. Chen reviewed everything with an increasingly troubled expression. When Galway finished, the vice principal was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is more extensive than I realized. I'm sorry you've been dealing with this. I need your support on this. I need to know that if I write Crew up formally, if I remove him from my classroom, that action will be backed by administration. I'll speak with Principal Morrison about this." "When?" "I'll try to catch him before he leaves today." "And then?" Chen's expression was sympathetic but guarded. "Then we'll see what we can do. I can't make promises about outcomes, Miss Thorne. There are procedures, due process requirements, parent conferences. These things take time." "Time for the behavior to get worse, you mean?" "I didn't say that. But it's what will happen. We both know it." Chen didn't deny it. She simply said, "I'll do what I can." Galway left the office knowing that what I can wouldn't be enough. The system was designed to protect students from abuse by teachers, as it should be, but it also created situations where persistent, strategic student harassment of teachers went largely unaddressed because the mechanisms for dealing with it were cumbersome, slow, and easily thwarted by parents with resources and connections. That weekend, Galway made a decision. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for information about King County Police Academy, her old employer. The academy was hosting a defensive tactics instructor certification course in 3 weeks. The course was open to law enforcement personnel and civilians with appropriate backgrounds. It had been months since she'd done any real training, since she'd been in an environment where her skills were valued and respected rather than something to hide. She registered for the course. It was a 5-day commitment, Thursday through Monday, which would require her to take 2 days off from school. When they saw Galway calmly setting up for the lesson, no visible reaction to the vandalism, something shifted in Crewe's expression. Frustration, maybe, or determination. The lesson that day was about the Mexican-American War. Galway had prepared a lecture followed by primary source analysis. She began her presentation, projecting maps onto the board, discussing the concepts of manifest destiny and territorial expansion. For the first 20 minutes, the class proceeded normally. Then Crewe raised his hand. "Yes," Galway said, "I have a question about territorial expansion." "Go ahead. How much space does someone need before they can command respect? Like, if you're super short and tiny, does that mean your territory is smaller? Is that why you can't control a classroom?" The question was deliberately insulting. Wrapped in pseudo-intellectual language, Jordan, Travis, and Damien snickered. Some other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Galway set down her marker and turned to face Crewe directly. "Physical size has nothing to do with respect or control. Respect comes from competence, consistency, and character. Control comes from understanding systems and how to work within them effectively. Your question reveals more about your limitations than mine." "My limitations?" Crewe's voice rose with indignation. "I'm not the one who can't handle a basic class. I'm not the one who looks like a scared little animal every time someone challenges them. I don't look scared, Crewe. I look patient. Again, two different things that you seem to have trouble distinguishing." "Yeah? Well, you should be scared, because nobody respects you. Nobody thinks you belong here. You're a joke." The classroom was silent. Every student watching the confrontation unfold, Galway could see on their faces that this had crossed a line, that even students who'd found earlier incidents amusing were now uncomfortable with the overt cruelty. But nobody spoke up. Nobody told Crewe to stop. They just watched, waiting to see what would happen. Galway walked slowly toward Crewe's desk. Her footsteps echoed in the silent room. She stopped about 4 feet from him, close enough that he had to look up at her, far enough to maintain appropriate professional distance when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Crewe. I see someone who's desperate for control because he feels powerless in other parts of his life. Someone who's been given everything, looks, money, status, but still feels empty. So you try to fill that emptiness by tearing others down, by creating situations where you feel dominant. You've chosen me as your target because you thought I'd be easy, small, new, female, young. Everything your experience has taught you means weak and vulnerable." Crewe's face had gone red. "You don't know anything about me. I know that you're scared right now. I know that something in this conversation has shifted and you're not sure how to handle it. I know that you're starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, you've miscalculated who I am and what I'm capable of." "You're not capable of anything," Crewe said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Am I not? Or have I simply chosen not to demonstrate my capabilities because I believe in giving students space to learn and grow? Because I believe that education should be about building people up rather than breaking them down?" She let that sit for a moment, then continued, "But here's what you need to understand, Crewe. Restraint isn't infinite. Patience has boundaries, and you've been testing both for weeks now, pushing and pushing, trying to find the breaking point. I'm telling you, clearly and directly, you're approaching it. What are you going to do?" Crewe's voice tried for mockery, but came out uncertain. "Write me up? Call my dad? He'll have it thrown out before lunch, same as always." "Maybe," Galway said. "Or maybe I'm done playing by rules that only seem to apply to one side. Maybe I'm done being the only person in this relationship who has to exercise restraint and professionalism while you get to act however you want with no consequences. She turned and walked back to the front of the classroom, feeling every eye on her. The rest of the period proceeded in tense silence. Crew didn't say another word. His friends kept their eyes on their desks. The other students seemed both relieved and anxious, sensing that something had fundamentally changed, but uncertain what that meant. After class, several students lingered as others filed out. A girl named Monica approached Galway's desk hesitantly. "Miss Thorne, I just wanted to say, what Crew's been doing is really wrong. A lot of us think so, we just didn't know how to say anything." "You could have said something at any point," Galway replied, not unkindly, but directly. Monica looked down. "I know, I'm sorry. He's Crew Hartman. His dad is important. People are scared to get on his bad side. Fear isn't a good enough reason to let cruelty continue." "I know you're right. I'll try to do better." Two other students nodded in agreement. They left, and Galway was alone with her thoughts and the knowledge that the confrontation wasn't over. She'd issued a challenge, drawn a line. Crew would have to respond, would have to reassert his dominance. The question was how far he'd go. The answer came on Wednesday. Galway was in her classroom during her planning period, grading papers, when her phone buzzed with the notification someone had tagged her in a post in the school's social media group. She opened it with a sense of foreboding. The post was a video. In it, someone had created a deepfake-style edit using footage that appeared to be from her classroom, combined with other elements. The video showed Galway Thorne saying things she'd never said, insulting students, using profanity, making inappropriate comments. It was crude work, obviously fake to anyone who looked closely, but to casual viewers scrolling through social media, it was damning. The post had been up for less than 10 minutes and already had 50 reactions and a dozen comments, most expressing shock or amusement. Galway's hands tightened on her phone. This crossed from harassment into something more serious: defamation, potential interference with her employment, possible legal territory. She took screenshots of everything, documenting the post, the account that created it, a fake profile, but with details that suggested it was Crew or someone he'd enlisted, and the comments. Then she walked straight to Principal Morrison's office. Morrison was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set, with the weary demeanor of someone who'd been in education administration too long. He listened as Galway explained the situation and showed him the video. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he watched. "This is serious," he said. "I'll need to investigate this, find out who's responsible." "I can tell you who's responsible. Crew Hartman and his friends have been running a sustained harassment campaign against me for weeks. I've documented everything. I've brought concerns to Vice Principal Chen multiple times. Nothing has been done, and now it's escalated to this." Morrison's face tightened. "Those are strong accusations, Miss Thorne. They're accurate accusations, supported by extensive documentation. Environment and administrative failure to address documented harassment." She left Morrison's office without waiting for a response. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding her system. She'd just burned a bridge, probably several bridges, but she was done being professionally polite while being professionally destroyed. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The fake video was taken down from the school's social media group, but not before hundreds of students had seen it. Galway could feel the attention on her as she walked through the hallways, could hear the whispers. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with amusement, a few with something like respect. That evening, She called the teachers' union representative, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd been teaching in Cleveland for 23 years. Galway explained the situation systematically, sending over all her documentation. Reeves listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. When Galway finished, Reeves said, "This is textbook hostile work environment, compounded by administrative failure to address documented concerns. You have grounds for a formal complaint, possibly even legal action. But I need to be honest with you about what that process looks like. It's long, it's exhausting, it's very public, and the administration will close ranks to protect themselves. They'll scrutinize everything about your teaching practice, looking for anything they can use to argue you're actually the problem, not the student or their failure to support you. So what do you recommend? Document everything, which you've already been doing. File the formal complaint, which I'll help you with. Prepare for a long battle. And in the meantime," Reeves paused. "In the meantime, you need to decide how much you're willing to sacrifice for this, because fighting this system will cost you. Energy, time, emotional resources, possibly your health. Only you can decide if it's worth it." Galway thanked her and hung up. She sat in her apartment surrounded by teaching materials and lesson plans, thinking about her father, about the promise she'd made, about the person she'd been trying to become, versus the person she actually was. She thought about restraint and weakness, about how they could look the same from outside, but feel completely different from within. She thought about all the recruits she'd trained over the years, how she'd taught them that real strength was about control. Control of yourself, control of the situation, control of the outcome. Never about dominating others through fear. But she'd also taught them that there were times when you had to act, when words and de-escalation weren't enough, when the only way to stop an aggressor was to demonstrate superior capability so decisively that they understood continuing their aggression would only bring pain. Thursday brought a new development. Galway arrived at school to find a notice in her mailbox. She was required to attend a meeting during her planning period with Principal Morrison, Vice Principal Chen, and Crew Hartman's father, Richard Hartman. The meeting was to discuss concerns about the learning environment in Miss Thorne's classroom. The framing was telling, not a meeting about Crew's behavior, a meeting about Galway's classroom management. She'd been a teacher long enough to recognize when responsibility was being shifted, blame being redirected. She arrived at the conference room during fourth period to find all three of them already seated. Richard Hartman was exactly what she'd expected from his billboards. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Galway made in a month. He had the same arrogant confidence as his son, but refined and polished by age and success. "Miss Thorne," Principal Morrison said, "please have a seat. Mr. Hartman has some concerns he'd like to discuss regarding your interactions with his son." Galway sat, placing her phone on the table in recording mode, legal in Ohio as a one-party consent state. "I have concerns as well regarding his son's sustained harassment campaign against me." Richard Hartman's eyebrows rose. "Harassment? That's quite an accusation. My son tells me you've been targeting him, making unfair accusations, creating a hostile environment. He says you told him you were going to stop playing by the rules and that you threatened him in front of his classmates. I've documented every incident involving your son, Mr. Hartman. Would you like to see the evidence? What I'd like is for you to stop harassing my child." "Your child has been harassing me, creating memes, mocking me, organizing vandalism of my classroom, disrupting instruction repeatedly, refusing to follow reasonable directions, and most recently, creating and distributing a fake video designed to damage my professional reputation. Those are serious allegations." Hartman said smoothly. "Do you have proof?" Galway pulled out her folder of documentation and slid it across the table. Photos, videos, witnesses' statements, social media screenshots, time-stamped logs of every incident, all here. Hartman didn't open the folder. "Boys will be boys, Miss Thorne. Kids test boundaries. It's part of growing up. A good teacher knows how to handle that without taking it personally. A good parent teaches their child to respect authority and treat others with basic human decency." Hartman's expression hardened. "Are you implying I'm not a good parent?" "I'm stating factually that your son has not learned those lessons and that his behavior has been enabled by a lack of consequences both at home and at school." "Miss Thorne," Chen interjected, her voice placating, "I think we all want what's best for students. Perhaps we can focus on strategies for improving the classroom environment going forward." "The strategy is simple," Galway said. Galway felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. "Is that meant to intimidate me?" she asked quietly. "It's meant to help you understand reality. You're a first-year teacher. You're replaceable. My son is a student here from a family with deep roots in this community. Who do you think the district is going to support?" Galway looked at each of them in turn. Morrison staring at the table, Chen examining her hands, Hartman meeting her eyes with cold certainty. She thought about her father, about promises and principles, about what strength really meant. "I understand reality perfectly," she said. "Better than you might think. The reality is that you've raised a son who believes he can treat people however he wants, without consequences, because his father will protect him. The reality is that this administration is more concerned with donations than with teacher safety or student character development. The reality is that the system is broken, designed to protect the powerful and punish those who challenge power." She stood, picking up her phone and her documentation folder. "But here's another reality. I'm done accommodating that system. I'm done being professionally bullied because it's easier for everyone if I just accept mistreatment quietly. I'm done restraining myself while nobody else has to show any restraint at all." "Miss Thorne," Morrison said warningly, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your tone. My tone is the least of your concerns right now. I'm filing a formal complaint with the union about hostile work environment and administrative failure to address documented harassment. I'm also consulting with an attorney about potential legal action, and I'm CCing the superintendent's office and the school board on all of my documentation. If you want to make my life difficult, Mr. Hartman, go ahead, but I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why. Because I refuse to let your son harass me without consequences." She walked out of the conference room, leaving them in shocked silence. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from suppressed rage or humiliation. It was adrenaline from finally pushing back. The rest of Thursday and all of Friday were tense. Galway taught her classes with heightened awareness, documenting everything, waiting for retaliation. Crew was absent from third period both days. Perhaps his father had decided to keep him home while they strategized. The other students were subdued, uncertain. Word had spread through the building about the confrontation, details distorted through the game of telephone, but the essence intact. The meek teacher had pushed back against the powerful student and his powerful father Friday after school. Galway received an email from Patricia Reeves. The union had reviewed her documentation and agreed to support a formal complaint. They'd also reached out to the district's legal counsel, making it clear that the union viewed this as a serious matter. The email included a formal notice that would be filed with the district office first thing Monday morning. That weekend, Galway prepared for her trip back to Washington. For the defensive tactics instructor course, she packed her training gear, her old GI, her belts. She felt lighter than she had in weeks, as if naming the problem and deciding to fight back had released some of the weight she'd been carrying. The flight Sunday afternoon was uneventful. She landed in Seattle, rented a car, and drove to the hotel near the academy where the course would take place. That night, she stood in the hotel room and went through the motions of warming up, basic movement drills that brought back a flood of memories. Her body remembered everything, even after months of dormancy. Monday morning, Galway walked into the King County Police Academy training facility and felt like she'd come home. The smell of the mats, the sound of techniques being drilled, the atmosphere of focused intensity, all of it familiar and centering. She checked in with the course administrator, who looked at her credentials and smiled. "Galway Thorne, I've heard about you. You used to run this program, right?" "I did." "Glad to have you back, even if just for a week." The course brought together 20 law enforcement professionals from various departments across the Pacific Northwest. Most were men, many significantly larger than Galway. She was the only woman in the course. Marcus reached out to grab her shoulder, moving slowly and telegraphing his intention. Galway met the grab, controlled his wrist, and in one smooth motion had him spun around with his arm locked behind him at an angle that made any resistance immediately painful. She held him there for a moment, applying just enough pressure to demonstrate control, then released and stepped back. Marcus rotated his shoulder, looking surprised. "Okay, can you show me that again?" They drilled for 20 minutes. Marcus trying different approaches and speeds, Galway calmly demonstrating the technique with variations. By the end of the session, Marcus was enthusiastically explaining to another participant how the small lady had some of the best technique he'd ever experienced. The week progressed with increasing intensity. Weapon retention drills, ground control positions, multiple attacker scenarios. Each day pushed harder, demanding more. Testing limits, Galway found herself connecting back to the part of her identity she tried to suppress. The competent, skilled, confident instructor who moved with authority and precision. On Thursday evening after training, Brennan pulled her aside. "You know, Thorne, we've had a hell of a time finding someone to replace you after you left. The program hasn't been the same. I don't know why you left or what you're doing now, but if you ever wanted to come back, we'd take you in a heartbeat." Galway felt a pang of longing. This world made sense to her. The rules were clear. Competence was valued. Respect was earned through demonstrated skill, not political maneuvering. But she thought about her father's dying words, about the promise she'd made. "I appreciate that, Davis, really. But I'm committed to teaching now, trying to make a difference in a different way." "How's that going?" "Honestly, it's harder than anything I did here." Brennan laughed. "I believe it. Teachers have my complete respect. I couldn't do what you do. I'm not sure I can either, but I'm trying." Friday brought the final evaluation, a scenario-based assessment where each participant had to demonstrate competency across all the techniques covered during the week. Galway's evaluation involved a simulated traffic stop gone wrong, then a ground fight with a resisting subject, then weapon retention against multiple attackers. She moved through each phase efficiently, transitioning between techniques smoothly, maintaining control throughout. When she finished, Brennan was grinning. "Looks like you haven't forgotten anything. Passed with distinction. Hell, you could teach this course." "I used to," Galway reminded him. "You could again." That evening, Galway sat in her hotel room with her newly renewed certification paperwork, thinking about the week. She felt recharged, reconnected to her competence and capability, but she also felt the tension between her two identities, the skilled martial artist and the patient teacher. The person who could decisively control physical confrontations, and the person who'd promised never to use violence again. She thought about Crew Hartman, about his entitled smirk and casual cruelty, about the way he'd looked at her after she'd dodged the thrown lunch tray. Surprised, uncertain, beginning to realize she might not be what she appeared. She thought about restraint versus weakness, about how much patience was wisdom and how much was cowardice. Her phone buzzed with an email. It was from Principal Morrison, time-stamped for Friday afternoon Cleveland time while she'd been in training. The subject line read, "Required meeting regarding your future at Roosevelt Technical." Galway opened the email. It was short, professionally worded, and carried an unmistakable threat. Her classroom management was being formally reviewed. Her teaching performance was under scrutiny. A meeting was scheduled for Monday afternoon with a district representative present. The implication was clear: come back ready to fall in line or face consequences. She stared at the email for a long time. Then she opened her response and began typing. The flight back to Cleveland on Sunday felt different than the flight out. Had Galway sat in her window seat watching clouds pass below, feeling the weight of the decision she'd made settling into her bones. Part of her still questioned whether she was doing the right thing, but a larger part, the part that had been slowly crushed under weeks of, "We're doing something different today." "What kind of different?" one student asked warily. "You'll see. Trust me, it'll be educational." Second period passed the same way. Students puzzled but compliant. The word spread through the school that something strange was happening in Thorne's classroom. By the time third period arrived, the hallway outside her door was crowded with students who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what was happening. Crew Hartman arrived with his 3 friends, back after his 3-day absence. He saw the rearranged room and his eyes narrowed. "What's all this?" "Take a seat with everyone else around the edges. I'll sit where I want. Today you won't. Sit or leave, and we'll have a different conversation in the principal's office." Something in her tone made him hesitate. He exchanged glances with his friends, then slowly walked to an open space against the wall and sat. Jordan, Travis, and Damien followed his lead. The rest of the class filed in, choosing spots around the perimeter. They ended up forming a loose circle around the open center space. When everyone was seated, Galway stepped into the center of the circle. 28 students watched her with varying expressions of curiosity, confusion, and apprehension. The hallway outside was packed with faces pressed against the door's window. "We're going to talk about respect today," Galway began. "Not in the abstract, theoretical way we've discussed it when studying historical events. We're going to talk about what respect means in practice, in relationships, in systems of power. We're going to talk about when it's appropriate to be patient and when patience becomes complicity in your own mistreatment." Crew shifted against the wall. "Is this about me?" "It's about all of us. But yes, Crew, you're going to be a central example because you've spent the past 6 weeks running an experiment on me, testing to see how much harassment I would tolerate, pushing boundaries to find my breaking point. Well, congratulations, you found it." The classroom had gone completely silent. Even the students in the hallway seemed to be holding their breath. "I haven't been entirely honest with all of you," Galway continued. "I presented myself as a first-year teacher, which is true, but that's not all I am. Before I became a teacher, I spent 8 years as the lead defensive tactics instructor at the King County Police Academy. I taught law enforcement officers how to control violent, resistant subjects. I have black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo. I competed in martial arts tournaments for over a decade. I am very, very good at controlling people who don't want to be controlled." She let that sink in, watching comprehension dawn on faces around the room. Crew had gone pale. I came into teaching with a promise to myself that I would never use that training, that I would be patient, understanding, and non-violent in all my interactions, that I would be a builder, not a destroyer. I tried very hard to keep that promise, but some of you, she looked directly at Crew, interpreted my patience as weakness, my restraint as inability. You thought you could harass me without consequences because I looked small and helpless, and you've been taught your whole life that people who look like me are easy targets. I didn't know. Crew started. No, you didn't know, but you also didn't care to know. You saw someone you perceived as weak and vulnerable, and your instinct was to exploit that, to hurt someone for entertainment, to establish dominance through cruelty. So today, we're going to have a different kind of lesson. Today, I'm going to teach you about the difference between can't and won't. Galway looked around the circle. I need a volunteer, someone who thinks they could physically intimidate me if they chose to. Nobody moved. The classroom was frozen. No volunteers? Then I'll choose Crew. Come here. Crew didn't move. His face had lost all color. I'm not doing anything physical with a teacher. That's not appropriate. You've been doing physical things with a teacher for weeks, shoving past me in hallways, knocking things off my desk, throwing food at me. But those were things you initiated, where you set the terms. This time, I'm setting the terms. Stand up and come here, or we all sit in silence until the bell rings. And then you and I have a very different conversation with administration about all your documented harassment. The threat was clear. Crew slowly stood, his friends watching with wide eyes. He walked to the center of the circle like someone approaching a gallows. Here's what's going to happen, Galway said. You're going to try to push me, just one push. Use both hands, as much force as you want. Try to knock me backward. Show everyone how weak and helpless I really am. I'm not pushing a teacher. You've been pushing me metaphorically for 6 weeks. Now we're making it literal, one push. Show me, show everyone, that I'm just a weak little hamster who can't do anything. Crew looked around the circle, seeing his classmates' faces. Knowing that backing down now would destroy his social status completely, he had to act, had to maintain his image. He raised his hands and placed them against Galway's shoulders, pushing with moderate force. Nothing happened. Galway didn't budge. She dropped her weight, angled her stance, created a base that was immovable despite her small size. Harder, she said calmly. Crew pushed harder. Still nothing. His face was reddening with effort and frustration. All of it. Show me what you've got. Crew shoved with everything he had, his full weight and strength behind the push. At the last possible second, Galway shifted her angle microscopically, redirecting his force. Crew stumbled past her, his momentum carrying him forward into empty space. He caught himself before falling, spun around, faces burning with humiliation. The class was dead silent, stunned by the casual efficiency of what they'd just witnessed. Again, Galway said, but this time, actually try. Don't hold back. Show everyone I'm just a weak teacher who can't handle physical confrontation. This time, they moved with intent, reaching for her with coordinated grabs. Galway's response was faster, sharper. She parried Crew's reaching hands, caught his wrist, and used a basic wrist lock to fold him forward at the waist while simultaneously stepping offline to avoid Jordan's grab. As Jordan overextended trying to catch her, she released Crew's wrist and used a simple arm drag to redirect Jordan's momentum, sending him stumbling past her into Crew. Both ended up off balance, controlled and vulnerable, while Galway stood centered and composed. Travis, Damien, come here, she said. The other two friends stood slowly, looking terrified. They joined Crew and Jordan in the center, all four of you at the same time. Try to grab me, push me, control me however you can. Demonstrate to everyone that I'm helpless against four stronger opponents. Miss Thorne, this isn't... Travis started. It's exactly what you've been doing for weeks. Just honest about it. You've been trying to push me, control me, dominate me. Now we're making it literal instead of metaphorical. Try to grab me. All four at once. They moved together, coordinating an approach from different angles. Galway's response was beautiful in its technical precision. She moved like water through their attempted grabs, using their own momentum against them, never using excessive force, but demonstrating perfect timing and leverage. Crew reached for her shoulder and found his hand caught in a wrist lock that put him on his toes, trying to relieve pressure. Jordan came from the side and got hip-tossed, landing on his back but controlled, so he hit the floor without injury. Travis tried to grab from behind and found himself spun around and off balance. Damien hesitated, seeing his friends controlled so easily, and Galway pointed at him. "Freeze!" He froze. She held them for a moment. Three of them controlled, one too scared to move, demonstrating absolute dominance despite being outsized and outnumbered. Then she released them and stepped back. "Sit down," she said quietly. They scrambled back to their seats, thoroughly humiliated in front of their peers and the crowd watching from the hallway. Galway stood in the center of the circle, breathing normally, not even winded. "Let me be absolutely clear about what just happened. I didn't hurt anyone. I used minimal force to control resistant subjects, exactly what I was trained to do. Everything I just demonstrated was defensive, controlled, and proportional. But here's what's important. I could have hurt them, easily. At multiple points during those demonstrations, I had opportunities to cause significant pain or injury. I chose not to. Just like I've been choosing not to respond to harassment with force for the past 6 weeks." She looked around at 28 stunned faces. "That's the lesson today. Not that I'm scary or dangerous, but that restraint is a choice, not a limitation. That patience isn't the same as powerlessness, that you can be kind and compassionate and still be capable of decisive action when necessary. And most importantly, that you should never mistake someone's kindness for weakness because you have no idea what they're choosing not to do." Galway pulled out her phone and set it on a desk near the circle's edge. "I recorded all of that. Video evidence showing that this was a controlled, educational demonstration where nobody was injured and students were asked to participate in showing force against me, which I then defended against appropriately. When I meet with Principal Morrison this afternoon, I'll be showing him this video along with all my documentation of the harassment that led to this moment. I'll also be explaining that I'm done tolerating abuse in silence." She looked directly at Crew. "You wanted to know what I was capable of. Now you know. You wanted to find my breaking point. You found it. You thought you could treat me however you wanted because I looked weak and helpless. You were wrong. But here's the truly important thing. Even now, after weeks of harassment, after being mocked and humiliated and targeted, I still didn't actually hurt you. I demonstrated control, not cruelty. Defense, not offense. I showed you what I could do, but I still chose restraint even in the act of pushing back." She addressed the whole class again. "That's what strength really looks like. Not dominating others because you can. Not tearing people down to build yourself up. Not exploiting systems to hurt vulnerable people. Real strength is controlling yourself first, then controlling situations, and using force only when absolutely necessary, and always proportionally. Real strength is showing mercy even when you don't have to." The bell rang, shattering the tension. Nobody moved. "Class is dismissed," Galway said. "And Crew, you're coming with me to the office. We need to have a conversation about what happens next." Students filed out slowly, many looking back over their shoulders. The crowd in the hallway parted to let them through, faces showing shock and excitement. Within minutes, the entire school would know what had happened. Crew stood reluctantly. His three friends looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the primary target. As the classroom emptied, Galway and Crew walked in silence toward the administrative offices. The hallways seemed quiet as they passed, students stopping mid-conversation to watch. They arrived at Principal Morrison's office. His secretary looked up, started to say something about his schedule, but Galway simply said, "He's expecting me, and if he's not, he should be. But instead are now necessary to apply to an administration that failed to do its job." She looked at Crew, who had shrunk down in his chair, trying to be invisible. "And you. You wanted to break me. You wanted to drive me out. You wanted to prove that you were stronger, and I was weak. Instead, you learned a very valuable lesson today about assumptions and reality. I hope it stays with you. I hope years from now, when you're tempted to target someone who looks vulnerable, you remember the teacher who could have hurt you but chose not to, who demonstrated mercy even when she had every right to defend herself aggressively." Galway turned back to the administrators. "So, here's what I'm proposing. Crew is immediately removed from my classroom and placed in a different section of American history. He receives appropriate disciplinary consequences for sustained harassment, suspension, mandatory counseling, whatever the student handbook actually specifies for this behavior. His father is formally notified that future harassment of staff will result in expulsion and administration issues, a clear statement that teacher harassment will not be tolerated and that proper channels for addressing it will be functional and supportive going forward." "And if we don't agree to these terms?" Chen asked. "Then I escalate every channel I mentioned. Union grievance, legal action, media exposure, social media documentation. I make this situation as public and uncomfortable as possible until something changes. Because I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for every teacher who's been harassed by students and failed by administration. Every person who's been told to be patient and understanding while being systematically destroyed. I'm done being complicit in my own mistreatment." Ellen Rogers closed the folder carefully and looked at Morrison. "Principal Morrison, why wasn't I informed about this situation before it escalated to this point?" Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "We were working through appropriate channels, trying to resolve it at the building level. By doing nothing and hoping the new teacher would either quit or stop complaining," Galway interjected. "That was the strategy, wasn't it? Let me get ground down until I either left or learn to accept abuse as part of the job." Rogers stood. "Principal Morrison, Vice Principal Chen, I'm going to need to meet with both of you privately. Miss Thorne, please return to your classroom. We'll be in touch by the end of the day regarding next steps. Crew, you're suspended pending investigation. I'll be calling your father to pick you up." "My dad's going to sue everyone," Crew said, his voice small and scared, trying for bravado but not quite managing it. "Your father is welcome to try," Rogers replied coolly. "I've reviewed Miss Thorne's documentation. The district has a strong case that his son engaged in sustained harassment of a staff member. If Mr. Hartman wants to escalate this legally, we'll be happy to respond with everything we have. Now go wait in the reception area." Crew left, closing the door behind him. Rogers looked at Galway with an expression that was hard to read. Part frustration, part respect, part calculation. "That was quite a demonstration, Miss Thorne. Technically, you could face disciplinary action for physical contact with students, even in the context you established. I could, Galway agreed, but you won't pursue that because doing so would require acknowledging that I had to resort to such measures due to administrative failure. It would make the district look negligent. It would support my hostile work environment claim, and it would make everything public in exactly the way you want to avoid. Roger's expression might have been the ghost of a smile. You've thought this through. I spent 8 years teaching people how to control situations and people. I know how systems work. I know how to apply pressure, and I know when to stop being patient and start being decisive. I see that. Go back to your classroom, Miss Thorne. We'll be in touch. Galway left the office and walked through hallways that had become strangely quiet. Students watched her pass with new awareness, whispers following in her wake. She heard fragments as she walked. Did you see what she did? Crew got owned. 4 guys couldn't even touch her. She's actually really scary. But she also heard other things. She didn't actually hurt them. She showed them up, but she didn't get violent. That was kind of respectful, actually. Galway reached her classroom to find several students already gathering outside the door, even though it was her planning period. They looked uncertain, but curious. "Can we ask you some questions?" one girl named Ashley said. "Come in." They filed in, 8 students from various periods, some who'd witnessed the demonstration, others who'd heard about it. They arranged themselves around her desk while Galway sat on its edge, trying to project approachability despite what they'd just learned about her. "Is it true you used to train police?" Ashley asked. "Yes, for 8 years. Why did you stop?" "My father was dying. He was a teacher his whole life, and he asked me why I was teaching people to hurt others instead of teaching young people to think and grow. I wanted to honor his memory by becoming the kind of educator he was." "But now you're using your fighting stuff anyway," a boy named Darius pointed out. "In a very specific, controlled way. I demonstrated defensive capability without causing harm. I showed restraint even while pushing back. That's the point. You can be capable of force and still choose not to use it, except in the most controlled, necessary situations." A girl named Priya spoke up quietly. "I'm glad you did it. What Crew was doing was really wrong. A lot of us saw it, but we didn't say anything because, I don't know, it was easier not to get involved." "That's called the bystander effect," Galway said. "It's one of the most powerful forces enabling abuse. When everyone thinks someone else will intervene, nobody does. Victims suffer in isolation while surrounded by witnesses." "But you did something," Ashley said. "You stopped being a victim." "I stopped accepting victimization," Galway corrected. "There's a difference. I spent weeks trying to work through appropriate channels. I documented everything. I followed procedures. When those systems failed, I had to make a choice about whether to keep suffering in silence or to push back in a way that couldn't be ignored. I chose to push back. But notice how I did it. No actual violence, no injuries, just a demonstration of capability that forced everyone to reevaluate their assumptions." They talked for another 20 minutes, questions ranging from her martial arts background to her teaching philosophy to what she thought would happen next. Galway answered honestly, trying to model the kind of transparent, thoughtful communication she wished she'd experienced from the adults in her life when she was their age. When they finally left, Galway sat alone in her classroom and let herself feel the exhaustion that had been building all morning. Her body ached pleasantly from the physical exertion. Nothing like the pain after a full training session, but enough to remind her that she'd done something significant. Her hands were shaking slightly with post-adrenaline reaction. She thought about her father, wished he could have seen what she'd done today. Would he have been proud? Or would he have seen it as a betrayal of the teaching philosophy he'd advocated? She wanted to believe he'd understand that sometimes principles had to be balanced with self-preservation, that restraint only worked when it was respected by others, that suffering nobly didn't actually help anyone. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia Reeves at the Union. Heard about today, bold move. District is scrambling. Call me when you can. Another text, this one from Davis Brennan at the Academy. Someone posted a video of you in a classroom. Did you just demonstrate defensive tactics on students? That's either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Call me. Galway smiled despite her exhaustion. The video was already spreading. By tonight, it would probably be all over social media. Tomorrow, the district would have to make decisions about how to handle the situation publicly. And throughout all of it, she'd have extensive documentation showing that everything she'd done was a measured response to sustained harassment that had been ignored by those whose job was to address it. The final 2 periods of the day were surreal. Her 4th and 5th period classes came in buzzing with excitement. Having heard various versions of what happened in 3rd period, Galway had to spend the first 15 minutes of each class addressing questions and correcting wild exaggerations before they could get to actual curriculum. No, I didn't knock anyone unconscious, she clarified in 4th period. I demonstrated control techniques that I used to teach law enforcement officers. Nobody was injured. But you totally destroyed them, right? One enthusiastic student asked. I demonstrated that their assumptions about me were incorrect. That's different from destroying anyone. The point wasn't humiliation, it was education. 5th period brought a surprising visitor. Monica, the girl who'd apologized weeks ago for not standing up to crew, raised her hand midway through class. Miss Thorne, I just want to say thank you for showing us that you don't have to just accept being treated badly, that it's okay to defend yourself, even against people who seem more powerful than you. Several other students murmured agreement. Galway felt unexpected emotion tighten her throat. Thank you, Monica, but I hope you all understand that what I did today was a last resort after exhausting every appropriate channel. The first response to mistreatment should always be using proper systems, reporting to authorities, documenting everything, seeking help through official channels. You push back decisively only when those systems fail and you have no other options. The final bell rang, releasing students into the afternoon. Galway was packing up her materials when her classroom phone rang. I'm sorry, Miss Thorne, I was wrong about everything. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't elaborate, but it sounded genuine, weighted with the reality of humiliation and consequence. I accept your apology, Galway said, and I hope your future actions prove it was sincere. Rogers continued. Additionally, Principal Morrison and Vice Principal Chen will be participating in mandatory training about responding to teacher complaints regarding student harassment. The district is implementing a new protocol for handling such complaints that includes specific timelines for response and escalation. And Miss Thorne will be receiving a formal letter of support acknowledging that she followed appropriate procedures and that administrative response was insufficient. Morrison looked like he wanted to object, but thought better of it. Chen stared at her hands. Are these terms acceptable to everyone? Rogers asked. Richard Hartman looked at his son, at his wife, at the documentation spread across the table. Finally, he nodded. We accept the terms. And He paused, clearly struggling with the words. I apologize for my role in enabling my son's behavior, for threatening you, Miss Thorne. That was inappropriate. Thank you, Galway said simply. The meeting concluded with signatures on various forms, documentation of the agreed-upon consequences, and scheduling for crew's transition to a different class section. As everyone prepared to leave, Crew approached Galway hesitantly. "Miss Thorne, can I ask you something?" "Of course. In the classroom today, you really could have hurt us, couldn't you? Like seriously hurt us." "Yes, but you didn't." "No, I didn't." That's the point, Crew. Power isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do when you could. It's about restraint, control, and using force only when absolutely necessary. You had power over me. Social power, institutional power, power that came from your father's money and connections. You chose to use that power to hurt me. I had physical power, the ability to defend myself, to respond with force. I chose not to use it except in the most minimal way necessary to establish boundaries and teach a lesson. I hope you'll think about the difference between those choices. He nodded slowly. Thank you for not, actually hurting us. Thank you for apologizing. It takes courage to admit you were wrong. Build on that courage. Become someone who doesn't need to diminish others to feel important. The Hartmans left, the administrators left. Galway sat alone in the conference room for a moment, processing everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed with multiple notifications, texts, emails, social media mentions. The video from her classroom had indeed gone viral, spreading across platforms with various reactions. Some praised her, some criticized her. Many debated the ethics of what she'd done, but everyone was talking about it, which meant everyone was thinking about teacher harassment, systemic failures, and the question of when patience becomes complicity. That night, Galway sat in her apartment and called Patricia Reeves. "You're either going to be a hero or fired by the end of the week," Reeves said by way of greeting. "Possibly both. How's it playing out?" "The union is fully supporting you. We're using your case to push for district-wide policy changes about handling teacher harassment complaints. The video is generating massive public discussion about teacher working conditions. Parents are divided. Some think you were justified, others think you crossed a line. Teachers across the district are coming forward with their own harassment stories. It's become a catalyst. I didn't mean to start a movement. I just wanted to be able to teach without being tormented. Sometimes individual stands become collective awakenings. You did something a lot of teachers have fantasized about, but never had the skills or courage to actually do. You showed that teachers don't have to accept abuse passively. That's powerful. It could also end my career. It could, but I don't think it will. The district can't afford the optics of punishing you after failing to protect you. They'll support you publicly while quietly resenting you privately. You'll be untouchable for a while. They won't dare discipline you for anything minor because it would look like retaliation. After they hung up, Galway stood at her window, looking out at Cleveland's nighttime skyline. She thought about her father, about promises and pragmatism, about the person she'd been trying to become versus the person she actually was. Maybe the answer wasn't choosing between her two identities, the martial artist and the teacher, the person capable of force and the person committed to education. Maybe the answer was integration, finding a way to be both without contradiction. To be strong and kind, capable and compassionate, willing to defend herself while still believing in mercy and growth. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected development. Galway arrived at school to find a crowd gathered near the main entrance. As she approached, several students began clapping, then more joined. Within seconds, she was walking through an applause gauntlet. Students she'd never spoken to showing support. "Miss Thorne, that was awesome what you did. Thank you for standing up to Crew. You're like a superhero teacher." The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable. Galway made her way to her classroom and found flowers on her desk. Simple grocery store bouquets, but the thought was touching. The card read, "Thank you for showing us that kindness doesn't mean weakness. Your fourth period class." First period proceeded normally, students seeming to sense that she needed to return to regular teaching rather than dwelling on yesterday's events. Second period brought a surprise visitor. Vice Principal Chen stopped by during the lesson. "Miss Thorne, may I speak with you in the hallway for a moment?" They stepped outside. Chen looked uncomfortable, her usual professional armor showing cracks. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I failed you. When you came to me for help, I prioritized institutional convenience over staff safety. I made assumptions about your ability to handle the situation because you were new, because you're small, because it was easier to ask you to adapt than to confront a difficult student with powerful parents. That was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology seemed genuine, difficult for her to articulate. Galway respected the effort. "I appreciate that. It's not easy to admit failure, especially as an administrator." "No, it's not. But yesterday you demonstrated what happens when teachers are pushed too far without support. The district is implementing new policies, but I want you to know that at this building level, I'm going to do better. If you ever have concerns again about anything, I'll address them immediately." "Thank you. That means a lot." Chen started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, what you did yesterday was extraordinary. Showing that kind of control, making your point without causing actual harm, maintaining your professionalism throughout. That took remarkable skill and discipline. I had good training. Still, most people in your position would have either crumbled completely or lashed out in anger. You did neither. You responded with precise, controlled force that taught a lesson without creating trauma. That's the mark of a real professional." Third period arrived, Galway's first time teaching this class since the demonstrations. The students filed in quietly, uncertain how to act. Crew's seat was empty, as were Jordan's, Travis's, and Damien's. All four had been transferred to different sections. "Welcome back," Galway said. "I know yesterday was unusual, probably the most unusual class any of you will ever experience, but today we're returning to normal. Today we're learning about the Missouri Compromise. Take out your textbooks, please." A hand raised. Monica. "Miss Thorne, can we talk about what happened yesterday? Like, process it?" Galway considered 10 minutes. "Then we move on to curriculum. What do you want to process?" The discussion that followed was remarkably mature. Students talked about feeling uncomfortable watching the harassment, but not knowing how to intervene. Several admitted they'd participated in sharing memes or laughing at incidents because everyone else was doing it. Others discussed the bystander effect, power dynamics in schools, and whether Galway's response was justified. "I think you had to do it," a usually quiet student named Raphael said. "Because nothing else was working. You tried the right way and got ignored. Sometimes you have to make people pay attention." But she didn't actually hurt them," Monica added. "That's important. She showed them up, embarrassed them, but she didn't cross into real violence. That's the difference between justice and revenge." "Do you think Crew will actually change?" someone asked. Galway thought about her answer carefully. "I think he has the opportunity to change. Whether he takes it depends on him. What I gave him yesterday was a clear understanding that his actions have consequences and that his assumptions about power were wrong. What he does with that knowledge is his choice. I hope he chooses growth over resentment." The 10 minutes stretched to 15 before Galway finally redirected to the Missouri Compromise. But the conversation had been valuable, processing the experience collectively rather than letting it fester unaddressed. The rest of the week proceeded with gradually decreasing attention on the incident. The viral video's engagement began to slow. News outlets moved on to other stories. Galway's classes returned to something approximating normal, though with a few notable changes. Students were more engaged, more respectful, more willing to participate in discussions. Even students from other classes treated her differently in the hallways. Not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor during Galway's planning period. Crew Hartman appeared at her classroom door, looking nervous. "It was just me bullying someone who was showing restraint. The moment you stopped holding back, I saw how powerless I actually was." "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," Galway said gently. "You were using cruelty to create an illusion of power because you felt powerless in other areas of your life. That's a very human response. Not a good one, but human. The question is what you do now that you understand that pattern." "I want to be better. I want to actually be someone, not just play at being someone important by making others feel small. But I don't know how." Galway thought for a moment. "When I left my job at the police academy to become a teacher, I was scared too. I'd built my entire identity around being a defensive tactics instructor. I was really good at it. People respected me for it. Walking away from that meant walking away from everything I knew about myself. I had to figure out who I was without that identity, and it's been really hard. I'm still figuring it out." "But you found something. You're a good teacher. Even when I was being awful to you, I could tell you actually cared about teaching us." "Thank you, but here's what I learned. You don't find yourself by tearing others down or by clutching onto external markers of success. You find yourself by figuring out your values, what you actually believe matters, not what other people tell you should matter. Then you make choices aligned with those values, even when it's hard." Extended difficult situation. The district commended her for her handling of a complex situation and supported her continued employment. New protocols for handling teacher harassment complaints would be implemented district-wide, with specific timelines and escalation procedures. It was careful, legally vetted language, but it was also official acknowledgement and support. Galway filed the letter carefully, knowing it protected her from retaliation and vindicated her stand. That afternoon, her fifth period class brought cupcakes they'd organized themselves. "We wanted to celebrate you," Monica explained, "for being awesome and not taking crap from anyone, but also not becoming mean." It was a sweet gesture that made Galway tear up slightly. They spent the last 20 minutes of class eating cupcakes and having a discussion about the role of teachers in society, about what made someone a good educator, and about how to balance compassion with boundaries. It was one of the best teaching moments Galway had experienced since starting her job. As the final bell rang and students filed out, Monica lingered. "Miss Thorne, I want you to know a bunch of us have been talking about how we were bystanders, about how we saw what was happening and didn't say anything. We decided we're going to do better. If we see someone being targeted, student or teacher, we're going to speak up. We're starting a kind of informal support group, people who commit to not being silent anymore." That's wonderful, Monica. That might be the most important outcome from all of this. Students learning to interrupt harm instead of enabling it. You taught us that by showing us what happens when nobody stands up for someone. By demonstrating that even one person standing up can change everything. Galway thought about that conversation as she drove home that evening. One person standing up can change everything. It hadn't felt like teaching in the moment. It had felt like survival, like finally pushing back after tolerating intolerable conditions. But apparently, it had taught something anyway. Maybe the most important lessons weren't the ones in formal curricula, but the ones demonstrated through action, through courage, through the willingness to say enough and mean it. The following weeks brought gradual normalization. The viral video's engagement faded as the internet moved on to newer outrage and entertainment. Galway's classes settled into productive rhythms. Students engaged with the material in ways they hadn't been during the harassment period. Other teachers began stopping by her classroom to share their own stories of student or parent harassment. Finding solidarity in knowing someone had successfully pushed back Principal Morrison remained distant but professional. Chen made visible efforts to be more responsive to teacher concerns. The new harassment reporting protocols were actually implemented, with dedicated staff to handle complaints and specific timelines for administrative response. Most surprisingly, Galway heard through the teacher grapevine that Richard Hartman had quietly donated funds specifically for a teacher support program, a way to save face while acknowledging some responsibility for how his son had been enabled. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. A month after the classroom incident, Galway received an email from one of Crewe's teachers in another subject area. It explained that Crewe had noticed a new student being picked on by some upperclassmen. Instead of participating or ignoring it, Crewe had stepped in, told the upperclassman to back off, and then befriended the new student, helping him navigate social dynamics. "I don't know what you did or said to Crewe Hartman," the teacher wrote, "but he's like a different kid this semester. Thank you for whatever role you played in that transformation." Galway smiled reading that. Crewe was making the small, consistent choices to be better. That was real growth, the kind that lasted. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, several months after everything had happened, Galway stood at her classroom window watching students stream out of the building toward weekend freedom. Her classroom was decorated now with student work, posters about historical events, and photos from various class activities. It looked lived in, comfortable, like a real learning space, like somewhere she belonged. Her phone buzzed with a text from Davis Brennan. "Still thinking about that video. Job offer stands if you ever want to come back to the academy, but sounds like you're making a difference where you are. Proud of you, Thorne." She typed back, "Thanks, Davis. I think I'm exactly where I need to be." And it was true. Teaching remained challenging. Student behavior issues, administrative bureaucracy, the exhausting emotional labor of helping young people navigate their development. But Galway had found a way to be both versions of herself, the skilled martial artist and the compassionate teacher. She could be capable of force while choosing patience. She could set firm boundaries while still believing in mercy and growth. She could be strong without being cruel, decisive without being violent. The lesson she'd taught her students, the real lesson, beyond the dramatic classroom demonstration, was that strength and kindness weren't opposites, that you could refuse to be a victim without becoming a bully, that the hardest thing wasn't responding with force, but knowing when to use it and when to hold back, and having the wisdom to choose appropriately. She thought about her father, imagined him watching her navigate these challenges. She'd kept her promise in the way that mattered most. She'd built up rather than torn down, even when forced to defend herself. She'd shown restraint, even while demonstrating capability. She'd chosen education over domination, even in the moment of confrontation. Galway picked up her bag and turned off the classroom lights. As she walked through the hallways toward the parking lot, students greeted her warmly. A few waved. One called out, "Have a good weekend, Miss Thorne." She smiled and returned the greetings, feeling the kind of professional satisfaction that had nothing to do with viral videos or dramatic demonstrations, just the quiet contentment of knowing she was making a difference, one student and one day at a time. In the parking lot, she passed a group of freshmen clustered together. One of them, a small girl who looked nervous and uncertain, was being teased by two larger students. As Galway approached, the two students noticed her and quickly backed off, mumbling something and walking away. The small girl looked up at Galway with grateful eyes. "You okay?" Galway asked. "Yeah. Thanks, Miss Thorne. They've been bothering me all week, but they always stop when teachers are around." "Have you reported it?" "I didn't think anyone would believe me. They're popular and I'm new." Galway knelt down slightly to be at eye level with the girl. "Listen to me. Report it. Document everything. Don't suffer in silence, hoping it will stop on its own. And if the first person you report to doesn't help, keep reporting up the chain until someone does. You deserve to feel safe at school. You have a right to learn without harassment. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you deserve mistreatment or that asking for help makes you weak." And the girl nodded, her expression shifting from scared to determined. "Okay, I will. Thank you." As Galway drove home, she thought about that interaction. How many students were facing similar situations? How many teachers? How many people in all contexts were suffering quietly, hoping someone else would intervene, believing they had to accept mistreatment because challenging it seemed too hard or too risky? Her situation had been unique. She'd had skills and training most people didn't. But the broader lesson applied universally. Silence enabled cruelty, patience had limits, and sometimes the most compassionate thing you could do was establish boundaries decisively. You didn't need to be a martial arts expert to stand up for yourself or others. You just needed to refuse to be complicit in your own mistreatment, to document and report persistently, and to understand that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. That evening, Galway sat at her kitchen table grading papers. Her laptop was open to her email, and she saw a message from Ellen Rogers with the subject line, "Teacher Support Initiative." The email explained that the district was using Galway's experience as a case study for developing better protocols for handling teacher harassment. They wanted her input on policy development and were asking if she'd be willing to train administrators on recognizing and responding to such situations. It was ironic in a way. She'd left her training career to become a teacher, and now her teaching experience was pulling her back toward training. But this was different. This was teaching educators how to protect and support each other, how to create environments where both students and teachers could thrive without fear. This was using her skills for building up rather than breaking down. She typed her response, "I'd be honored to contribute. Let's schedule a time to discuss the initiative in detail." Over the following months, Galway became an unofficial expert on teacher harassment prevention within the district. She conducted training sessions for administrators, helped develop new policies, and served as a mentor for teachers facing difficult situations. Her classroom remained her primary focus. She was, after all, a teacher first. But this advocacy work gave her a sense of purpose beyond her individual classroom. The story of what happened that day in her third period class became part of Roosevelt Technical's law. New students heard versions of it from older students, details distorted through retelling, but the essence intact. Don't mess with Miss Thorne, but also, Miss Thorne cares about students and will give you every chance to do better before taking action. Crew graduated the following year and left for college. Before he departed, he stopped by Galway's classroom one last time. "I'm going to University of Washington," he said, "planning to major in social work. My therapist thinks I'd be good at it, helping people, especially kids who are struggling, using my experience with being both a bully and learning to be better." "That's wonderful, Crew. I think you'll be excellent at it." I wanted to thank you for that day in the classroom. I know it was humiliating and awful at the time, but it changed me. It made me realize that the person I was becoming was someone I'd end up hating. You gave me a chance to become someone different, someone better. I'll always be grateful for that. You did the hard work of changing, crew. I just provided the catalyst. Be proud of yourself for choosing growth over resentment. After he left, Galway sat at her desk and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. This was why she'd left the academy. This was the impact her father had talked about, shaping young minds, helping people become better versions of themselves, creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond any individual interaction. She pulled out a photo of her father from her desk drawer, one she kept but didn't display. He was smiling in the picture, standing in front of a chalkboard in his classroom, surrounded by students. The photo had been taken a year before his diagnosis, when he was still healthy and vital and doing the work he loved. "I hope I made you proud, Dad," she whispered to the image. "I tried to honor what you believed in. I tried to be the kind of teacher you were, but I also stayed true to who I am, to the skills and strength that are part of me, I think." That lesson, that fundamental understanding that true strength was about control, restraint, and wise application of capability, rippled out from Galway's classroom into the broader school community, and beyond. Students who learned it carried it with them into their adult lives, becoming the kind of people who intervened when they saw injustice, who refused to be bystanders, who understood that silence in the face of cruelty made you complicit. Years later, Galway would receive messages from former students thanking her for teaching them how to stand up for themselves, how to set boundaries, how to be strong without being cruel. They'd tell her about situations where they'd applied the lessons learned in her classroom, not the content about the Revolutionary War or the Missouri Compromise, but the deeper lessons about character, courage, and the responsible use of power. And Galway would think about her father, about the promise she'd made, and the complex way she'd kept it. She hadn't abandoned her martial arts background. She'd integrated it into her teaching identity. She used her understanding of power, control, and discipline to create classroom environments where all students could thrive. She modeled the kind of strength that protected others rather than dominated them, that established boundaries without crossing into cruelty, that responded to provocation with measured precision rather than overwhelming force. She had become, in her own unique way, exactly the kind of educator her father had hoped she would be, not by rejecting who she had been, but by bringing all of herself, skills, experience, strength, and compassion into her teaching practice. She'd learned that you didn't have to choose between being capable and being kind. You could be both. You should be both. And that lesson, more than any other, was what she hoped her students would carry forward into their own lives. That the greatest strength lies not in dominating others, but in knowing when to show force and when to show mercy, and having the wisdom to choose appropriately in every situation.